Well, I'm Joe Wallach, and luckily living here in Beverly Hills with my lovely wife and enjoying our life here. I was born in Lower East Side of Manhattan, but at a very young age, I moved to the Bronx, and that's where I spent my boyhood, my adulthood, my childhood, till I went into the Army. I had a wonderful childhood. We had a marvelous family. We were 3 children. My brother, sister, and I, my mom and pop, and we just had, I have wonderful memories of my entire childhood. I remember going to school, to grammar school. I skipped some grades in grammar school, second, third grade, and 6th grade. So I finished 8th grade when I was 12 and a half years old. And then I went to high school. But the high school was not in the Bronx. The beginning of the high school was down in Manhattan, near the Museum of Natural History on 77th Street, where the Hayden Planetarium was. And so I had to walk about a mile to the subway, which was an elevated subway, and the elevator man would open up the gates to get into each car, and we'd pass the Yankee Stadium on the way and go above the streets in the Bronx over to Manhattan till I got down to school. Our boys' school, high school, only had 10,000 boys, but it was in 3 different areas. Freshmen went in Manhattan. Sophomores went to one branch in the Bronx, and finally the seniors went to the main branch. So that was my high school days. But before that, I can tell you about our life there in the Bronx. Well, my parents were very loving. My mother was born in New York in 1898. She went to high school and was a bookkeeper, married my father. My father came to this country when he was about 6 years old, and they married, and they started working together in a milk store. My grandfather was a pretty rough guy. He was the one who sold them the milk store. In those days, they bought milk in big cans. People would come in with little cans of milk, and they'd get it filled from the big can. And so my grandfather sold the milk store to them using my mother's dowry. She had saved her money for working as a bookkeeper, gave him all the money, and he gave them the milk store, and they couldn't make a living in the milk store, so that was that. We grew up in the Bronx in we were very poor. We lived in a 6-story building, and it got so, people couldn't pay their rent. The landlord would just move all the furniture out on the sidewalk. We lived the beginning in a 1-bedroom apartment. There were first 4 of us, and then 5. And my brother and I shared a bedroom, and my sister slept with my parents in another bedroom. And that sometimes we couldn't pay the light bill, so the lights would be out until we could pay the bill. And we all worked. We had a little laundry first my father worked in a car himself when I was a boy in grammar school and high school. We'd get up at 7 in the morning, go pick up bundles from early customers before they went to work. So he'd just give me a ticket, and I'd run up 4 or 5 flights of stairs, and I would get their laundry. And then he'd drop me off at school. Before school, we'd go in and I'd have coffee and a piece of cake. He'd drop me off at school, at high school, and then he'd pick me up again after high school, and I'd continue on the truck with him. My father's name was Samuel. My mother's name was Ida. My father was born in Austria-Hungary at that time, in 1898. They were both born the same year. My father was 9 months older than my mother. My mom was born in New York City on the Lower East Side, and she was brought up in the Bronx by her brother, one brother, a sister, and there was an older brother who was born maybe 10, 15 years earlier. My dad, well, I remember him as somebody who loved to work outdoors. We had a little store. We all worked in the store ironing. I was ironing. My mother was washing and ironing. My father would be the outside all day picking up bundles. And he would come home. He would come back to the store later in the day, and he would be sorting out laundry, preparing it for the customers. But what I remember of him, he said things as they were. He was very talkative. People liked him, and he liked to talk with people. He's quite an outgoing. My mother was, she was more quiet. I think if it came to raw intelligence, looking back on it, was probably smarter. But they got along pretty well. The only thing they ever argued about was my grandfather, who tried to use my father for various of his sundry businesses. He was what they call a shotgun in Jewish. That meant a matchmaker. He would get young people and put them together on dates for which he charged $25. If they got married, he charged $200. Then he became a self-ordained rabbi, and he'd marry the people, collect a little bit more. He was quite an impressive man. Well, I learned everything from them. I learned how to be loving. We were a very loving family. We were very much together, including my aunt and her sister and so on. And my mom, we'd sit in the kitchen at night. We ate in a small kitchen, and then my mother would tell us all the things of the day when we were small, the things that we should know, the things we did right, the things we did wrong, And so she was great, and she encouraged us. She encouraged me to study, and they wanted, they were quite Orthodox Jews. My brother and I were very close friends. I was 3 years older than he. And then along came my sister, who was 8 years younger than I was. My brother and I slept in the same bedroom. And of course, we were great baseball fans. we didn't live very far from the Yankee Stadium. So we go down there during the summer and we turn turnstiles for people to come in. And so then they let us in free to see the games. So we'd see most of the games during the summer. Well, my first job was working with my dad, and I worked pretty hard there. As I said, he picked me up from school, and then after that, when we had the laundry store, I was working in the laundry. So I was about 13 years old, working inside the laundry and going to school, and I kept that up. I finished high school. Going to high school was pretty rough. Finished high school when I was 16. I had to travel pretty far to get to school, and I had to walk up 132 steps to get to our neighborhood from the valley. And, there were a lot of guys, a lot of boys, tough guys. Some of them were from Harlem, from all over, and they would pull the cords on the trains. Trains would stop. It was, I was a pretty good student, but I was, okay. But it was hard. My father took sick. He almost died. He got pneumonia when I was 14, lobar pneumonia. And in those days, the doctor was everything, but he'd come into the house, all he had was a satchel and a stethoscope. Father had pneumonia, and all he did was they said, well, open up the windows, let the fresh air come in. And they put these cups of alcohol and fire on his chest to bring up circulation. We didn't know whether he'd live, but he made it. He lived, thank goodness. He lived through and he made it. So it was pretty tough. He had to start working again, and we, of course, could barely make a living. That's why the high school years were tough. When it was time for me to go to college, the college I went to was City College in New York. And to get into there, you had to have pretty high grades. It was out of every 1,000 who applied, I think they took in about 15. And so it was free. The college was absolutely free. Just had to pay for a library card. Cost $2.50 a semester. But they couldn't afford for me to go to college during the day because I had to work in the laundry. So I started at night, and the first semester was bad. I took a couple of subjects, math and Spanish. I think I got a C and a D because you'd fall asleep 10 o'clock at night. So then they said, well, Joseph has got to go during the day. So they sacrificed whatever they could, and I started to go to college, George City College in New York, during the day. And I just had enough for the nickel to get to the school, and my lunch, believe it or not, was half a pound of raw prunes. That was all we could, we could afford. And the books, in those days they had used books. They tried to buy them from other kids and then resell them. And so when I started college, I got the first job outside. I went to college from about 9 to 5, and then I took the train all the way up to where the George Washington Bridge is in Manhattan. And underneath that, on that street, 180th Street was a drugstore. They didn't call them pharmacies. It was a drugstore, one-man drugstore, and he had a soda fountain there. And I would work at the soda fountain alone from 6 p.m. until midnight, for which I was paid $1. And then I would walk from there in Manhattan all the way across the bridge to the Bronx and down to our house, and then go to sleep, get up the next morning, and take the train down to Manhattan to go to school. So I did that during the first year of college. The second year of college, I got a job, another job, and this was fabulous. By then I could go to school only from 8 until 1, because once you got to a higher class, you could choose your classes and better hours. It was taking 17 credits. And then I worked from 1:30 to 6:30 down in what's today called Soho, down in Canal Street in bottom of Manhattan. I worked for this one man who was a Russian Jew, and he had a little lithography place. And there I learned all about lithography from him. I learned how we'd paint. He made instrument dials for merchant ships, instrument dials made out of metal for merchant ships. And so what we would do is we would have to draw the dials, then we'd have to photograph them, go into a private little photograph shop, get the photographs out properly, then make these big negatives, and then we'd put them on a big flatbed and we'd have to ink. We'd have these rollers, roll the ink. We'd roll these rollers over the negative to get ink on the negatives. And then these were big flatbed trucks, and we'd roll a huge rubber roller over the negative, would go on to the rubber, or the image would go on to the rubber roller, and we'd keep rolling the roller onto the tin plate, which we had painted white enamel, and it would print on that tin plate a load about 12 dials. Then we had to take that big plate and we had to by hand get a little place where we'd cut them off to make the round dials. But you had to be very careful with the enamel that we sprayed on the tin plate, because when you went to cut the dials and the plate, the tin would chip, the plate, the enamel would chip. And so maybe 20% of them didn't come out right. So all we'd have to do was pick out the good ones, and that's how we'd ship them. Anyway, I learned how to do lithography completely. And he said to me, well, Joe, you know, if you got $500, you could join the lithographers union and you could get a job that would pay you $4 an hour. $4 an hour. My father wasn't making anywhere near that much. Well, it would take me to get home from down the Lower East Side to the Bronx. My hands were black from ink and what have you. Get back home. I'd work till 6:30, 1:30 or 6:30. Get back up home. And I didn't have time to do any homework to speak of. I could barely do my homework. But anyway, when he told me this about joining the union, I came home to my mother and father, and I said, I think I'm going to quit school, because I told them the story. And I said, we'd have to find $500 and I can go. And my father was very interested, but my mother begged me. She said, Joseph, please don't stop going to college. Nobody in our family had ever been to college, or any generation before. And so she talked me out of it, and I didn't join the union, and I didn't become a lithographer. So I did that during my second year in college. The year that I started college was 1940. That's when I went, and I stayed in college till June of 1943, when I went into the Army. I was very optimistic, and I was very thrilled. The only thing I didn't like was that I had a great deal of acne on my face. A great deal of acne, and I thought the girls wouldn't look at me, when I was 16. And so, what could I do? Because that's what we all had to do. My mother was working. She'd run from the store to the apartment to cook and to clean, and I would help clean the apartment on weekends. All of us worked. We had to keep going. We didn't know we were poor. We had no idea, of what it was, because we lived in that neighborhood. That's where we lived. Well, what we did, we had a truck. And when we were kids, my father had a laundry truck. And the truck was very important. We had to pay $18.75 a month was the payment to the CIT Corporation. And frequently, we couldn't make the monthly payments. We didn't have the money. So they would come and try to repossess the truck. And what we would do is we'd hide the truck in a certain area where they couldn't find it. And that's how we'd get by for a while, because they didn't know how to do it. Well, the other thing, our life at dinner, we didn't have much to eat for dinner. You're talking about what money could buy. Our typical dinner would be spaghetti, and frequently the tomato sauce out of a can, and some chocolate pudding. And that would be the treat. And on Friday nights, my mother would make chicken. She'd buy chicken. And boy, oh boy, poor thing, she worked hard, so she wasn't a very good cook, but she was kosher. And so she had a kosher chicken, and she'd salt it, put a lot of salt on it, and that chicken was white by the time it was ready to eat. It was so white, hard, that when we ate it, and that was our dinner, we'd all sit around the table and eat that chicken. When I went into the Army later on, I thought the Army food was delicious. Most guys complained. I said, boy, this is heaven. I'd never eaten as well. Anyway, then we'd sit around on Friday nights and we'd have our chicken dinner, and my parents would sing songs from World War I, from the time when we were kids. And that's one thing we always did. We always sang together. And then if there was any chicken left over on Saturday, my brother and I would eat the chicken for lunch, and we'd take a bath, our weekly bath, in the bathtub. If there was no chicken left, then my mother would have me go to a delicatessen store, which was a treat, and I'd buy 4 rolls, 4 little tiny rolls, and she said, Joseph, go to the delicatessen store, and I want you to buy half a quarter of a pound of bologna. She didn't say an eighth of a pound. She said half a quarter pound of bologna and a lot of mustard, and that was our lunch. So we also grew up with a tough neighborhood, tough kids. They were mainly Jewish, Irish, and some Italians. And on the next block was the Sacred Heart Church, and I went to the synagogue, the little synagogue that we had, which was built when I was 13, and I was the first one bar mitzvahed in it. Anyway, the kids in the neighborhood were kind of rough. We played stickball on the streets, and some of them went a bad way as they grew older. Some of them didn't turn out too good. When they were in their late teens, some of them robbed a market in the neighborhood. They had to go to jail. But we, I was, we were good boys, although we had to fight our way with the other kids in the street. Till what happened is when I was about 15, my mother largely talked me into joining this organization for Jewish youth, which was called the AZA, and that was for kids from 15 to 21. They could go in there, and I rebelled. I said, no, I don't want to go in with all those sissies, as we called them then. She said, you join this AZA. And that really changed my life as a teenager, because when I joined that, it was a group of about 30 kids. Maybe there were 25, I don't know. And they had the supervisors were from an organization called B'nai B'rith, which was the senior adult Jewish group. And they'd train us in we had a program of 5 things. It was called cultural, athletic, social service, and religious. And so we had meetings every Sunday. And in those meetings, they were held in regular what do they call them? Charter style, where we had a president, a secretary, a treasurer, we had new business, old business, we'd play ball together, we did a lot of things together. And it was there where I learned how to speak in front of a group, because I was at one point elected vice president of the chapter, so you had to get up and talk. And then we'd have social affairs. There was a girls group, and we'd have dances, and then we'd do things to help the community. So I learned a lot at that age in the AZA. And we did a lot of entertainment too. We'd put on shows. We'd put on shows when we had little booklets, which I can show you one of what we did. We danced. Aleph Zedek Aleph, known as AZA. And they had chapters all over the country. And in New York, we were just one in the Bronx, section of the Bronx. In New York, they must have had about 10 chapters, because New York had a lot of Jewish people there. So later on, when I was in college, I was elected president of the AZA chapters of all New York. I did that because I learned how to do public speaking. I took public speaking at college too. So I I got to be pretty good at it. It exists, but I don't know how influential, how what it does today, but I'm sure it exists somewhere around the country. I saw other boys and girls. It was a way of getting to see and learn about parliamentary procedure. That's what it is, about how an organization ran. Because I was in high school then, and you know, some of the kids were already in college because they were between 15 and 21 years old, and they had these programs. So I learned from them. I learned how to be more social, how not to be a quiet, inward kid, and to be more outspoken. And so that's what it gave me. It gave me more of a personality. Although I must tell you that I always had confidence in myself. I always felt that I could do anything if I was given the chance. I was probably born with it, because even when I was a youngster, I'd be lying in bed, my brother in the other bed, and I'd think, boy, Joe, just think of how your family is so happy now. Someday you're going to get married. It seemed incredible. And you're going to have your own family. And that made me so happy at the time, you know. So I was quite optimistic. And but I really gained confidence in the AZA because of all the activities that we were doing and some of the responsibilities. Like we'd have these dances, Halloween dance, where each boy had to bring a girl to the dance. And we had donuts and apple cider and a little bit of a Victrola playing music. And the admission was you had to pay $1 a pound for the weight of the girl. And so we had a little scale there, and the one who would bring the heaviest girl got in free. So, you know, I didn't know any girls, but my aunt had a friend who had a girl, so I asked this girl to go. She was a pretty girl, but she was a little chunky. I mean, she wasn't fat, but I had to pay. I didn't win. I think she weighed I had to pay about $1.26, which was a lot of money. It was a penny a pound. So I had to pay about $1.26 for her. And all the things that we did there, we played ball together, we had teams together, you know, that gave me a lot of confidence. And I also started working elsewhere when I was 16. By 17, when I was over 17, 18, I was working in lithography. And I saw I could do that. Then I went to work for the accountants. So it really sort of gave me, so I could do anything. And after that, man, nothing could stop me. Anyway, when you finished second year of college, you had to decide what to major in. And I didn't know what to major in. And I had no idea. Because when I finished high school, believe it or not, I told them I wanted to be a forest ranger. And my parents went crazy trying to find a college or any place where I could study forestry. And there were only two universities in the country. One was the University of Syracuse, and the other one was in Idaho, the University of Idaho. And we couldn't afford for me to go to college anyplace else or pay for anything. So that was that. I couldn't study forestry. But anyway, when I finished the 2 years, I said, what do I major in? So my grandfather came along, who was a real twister, and he said, look, he said, why don't you study to be an accountant or business? Because then if you open up a drugstore, you'll know how to run it. So that's what I did. I majored in business administration during my last stint in college, and I went to work for 30 hours a week with a public accounting firm. Their name was Weiss and Gold. They were two guys, two CPAs, on 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue in New York, right next to the New York Public Library, which was the big library in New York. And that's where I worked. I had my own clients, working for them, did taxes. I had to go out, little shops of all kinds. And I did that until I was called into the Army in 1943, June. I had about 8 credits left to finish college, but I couldn't finish college then. I was in the enlisted reserve corps, and that had allowed me to stay in college an extra year. I was 19 and a half when I went into college, into the Army. I would have gone at 18 and a half, but I was in enlisted reserve corps, and then they called us all up then because things were getting kind of tricky in Europe, in the fighting. And the U.S. Army had been in Africa, and they were beat up in Africa, so on. I could go anywhere and do anything. I had that feeling inside of me. So much so that when I went into the Army, I went into the Army, and they gave us an IQ test in June 1943. And I scored very high. I scored 143, which was, top level. And in order to get in it, to become an officer, you had to have 120. Anyway, when I got into the Army, what did they do? I had taken 1 credit of ROTC at college. It was an easy military credit, and it was infantry ROTC. When I went into the Army, they stuck me in the infantry. Certainly, most of the kids I knew went to the Air Force because they got a higher IQ. But because of my schooling, I was in the infantry with kids who couldn't even write. I had to write letters home for some of these guys in the infantry, and they were tough. So I was sent to Camp Wheeler, Georgia. First I went to Fort Dix, then they sent me to Camp Wheeler, Georgia. It took me 36 hours to get there. We got there by train, and starting out in the month of July, in the heat of Macon, Georgia, is where we were. And we were standing out there, and there's this little sergeant standing out there, a tall guy next to him, and he said, "I'm Sergeant Maisel." He says, "and I want you to know," and this is my assistant, Corporal Cox. I remember their names. "I want you to know that as long as you're here, I'm your little Jesus," he said to us. And I thought, what is this all about? Well, we had 17 weeks of basic training in the infantry, in Camp Wheeler, Georgia, which was tough. It was tough going in the summer in the heat. Guys would plop out. They couldn't take it and so on. And we had a lot of fights in there. Guys were so dumb, they would go around. One guy, I remember he was from Ohio, on Sundays, didn't have to work. He'd pull out his penis and he'd walk around with his pecker, challenging anybody, see if they had one as big as he had. That was the kind of thing. And we'd write, I'd be writing letters for some of them. It was a tough experience. After a year of doing that, things got really going, and the U.S. Army abandoned that program. And they gave me the choice. They said either you can go to officers' candidate school in the infantry, or you go overseas now. So I said, sure. I wasn't in a hurry to go into combat. I said, I'll go to officer school at Fort Benning, Georgia. And that's where I went for the next 4 or 5 months. And got into officer school, and that was, of 200 that started in our class, 90 graduated. Well, they taught us how to, first of all, they taught us how to handle a platoon, because we were eventually in charge of 40 soldiers. In the infantry, they taught us about things in the infantry, where the enemy is, the way you're supposed to handle, how you handle your men, and so on. Many things that I can't even remember, but the training was very, very strong and very good. It prepared us, both physically and mentally, to be able to handle 40 men in combat. That's what we were trained to do. During the rest of my time in the Army, I always had men working under me as an officer. I became a first lieutenant, and I was doing different things. At first it was very scary. It was frightening. Then it was, in combat, it was, trying to stay alive and doing my job. And then, after I was no longer in the infantry, it was different. It wasn't a marvelous, it was not a wonderful time of my life. I think it was our duty to do what we had to do to stop Hitler and stop, otherwise the world would be different. And I felt that way then. And I'm glad that we did that. Not only that all of us, our country was marvelous in the way we put things together so quickly, the way we produced so rapidly. We were making 50,000 planes a year, or a month, I don't know. We were turning out tanks, turning out stuff. It was just miraculous. But while we were going through it, it was just hard, mean, dirty. wasn't easy. Some things I can tell you about. Like when we went to go overseas in December 44, it was winter. I had to take with me. I was responsible for taking overseas on the ship 200 soldiers who had been general prisoners in Camp Edwards, Massachusetts. They had committed crimes while they were in the army, and they were put in prison. Either they killed or robbed or did bad things. And so I was given the job of taking 200 general prisoners as part on this ship that we were on, which was built for about 300 people. They put 2,000 of us, of which I was responsible for my 200 prisoners. I had just graduated from OCS, had 10 days leave, and was shipped overseas. But I just did it. I just knew, didn't feel big. But what happened, some of it was funny, because they put these men, the ship had 4 decks, as I recall, and my men were put in the lowest deck underwater, which was really under the ocean where they were. The officers would sleep up with another officer in a cabin. But I had to spend the days with my men. And so when the guys looked at me, a little guy when they first came there, said, "What is this guy?" But luckily, one of the big guys was from the Bronx. Another one, Italian guy, 2 guys. And they took a liking to me. And they said, "Listen, you guys, you listen to what the lieutenant has to say." Because they didn't care. They weren't paying attention to what anybody asked them to do. These were guys who were prisoners, you know what I mean? But anyway, they were there, and sorry, I'm gonna get a little upset. We were out. It was middle of winter, and we were about 40 ships in a convoy, destroyers protecting us. I don't know what others ships. And of course, German submarines were out hunting us. It took us about 14 days, I think, to get over. Maybe less, I don't remember. But in the middle, there must have been submarines in the area. And they dropped depth charges from the ship into the water. And when they did those, they exploded way under the water. It felt as if the ship was hit. And when they felt as if the ship was hit, everybody started running to the top of the ship, including the guys I had, And we didn't know. We thought we were hit. We weren't. When I got to the top, the one in charge of the whole thing to bring the whole 2,000 to our point of where we were to go into combat was a major, and he was in the transportation corps. And all his job was to bring men back and forth. And before that, he said, most of us got seasick, including myself, because I'd never been on a ship before, and that lasted a couple days. Until then, you were no longer seasick. But the smell was, around the ship, so on. And the major said, oh, don't worry, there's nothing. But when they dropped the depth charge, the interesting thing I noted, some of these things are funny. A lot of stuff is funny now. When I got up there were lifeboats. The major was stepping into a lifeboat. I thought, what kind of guy is this? Because we officers would eat together separately from the soldiers. I forgot to tell you something in Camp in basic training about blacks and whites. They separated us. And that's another story. Two of the guys that went to college with me were black, and they were there. And the only way I could see them was on Saturday night, sneaking in Macon, Georgia, talking to them. Well, it's so long ago, John, that some of it seems like a dream. It really does, some of it. I was in charge of 200 general prisoners, and we were on the ship. Depth charge happened. We continued on, and we got to our port, which was Le Havre. American troops, we got there in December 44. D-Day had been in June, so American troops were on battling. And so we got off the ship, and we went around to the railroad station. It was snowing, wintertime, in Le Havre, France. And first time I saw a toilet in France, and it was just a hole in the ground at the railroad station. And Americans, we were unprepared completely for the way people lived in Europe. We were very provincial because there were no means of communication that we have today. Anyway, I got my men on these trains. The trains, they were closed cars. They were closed freight cars. They were meant to hold either 40 men or 8 horses. And so we put 40 men in each of these freight cars, closed the door, and we started going towards the front, which was in Belgium. The troops were in Belgium at that time, fighting in the Battle of the Bulge. And it took us 3 days to get there from France, the point, to Belgium. And during those 3 days, the train would stop frequently. It was a big train, and sometimes German planes would come over and try to bomb. But the big thing was the train would stop, and we'd never know when it would start again, because the distance was not that great. So what the men would do, we were all young guys, and these soldiers who were with me, all they were looking for were women. They'd say, boy, how do we get out they had the word zig zig, find zig zig, get a girl. So every time the train would stop for a while, they would run away from the train looking in the countryside or whatever to find women. And then the train would start to go again, and some of them were left behind. They never caught up with the train. Well, it got to the point where, as I saw it happening, I thought, what the hell? Everybody had what was called your 201 file. You had your envelope, and in there it had everything about you in that envelope, in addition to the heavy duffel bag where we had our belongings. So I said to the guys, whenever you take off, if you take off, don't forget to take your file, your 201 file with you, which they did. And so I don't know how many guys we lost that were running off and then didn't make it back to the train, so on. And that's what happened until we got to Belgium, near our point of embarkation, our point of where we were supposed to go and bring everybody to where we were then assigned from there to different units. They were let out of jail on the condition that they went into combat in the infantry. And that's what they did. To get out of prison, they had to go to the front lines. And when we got on the train to go to where we were going, which took 3 days, it was hard to manage anybody because of it was snowing, snow all around. These guys, some of them would take off, the others would stay. The food we had, certain rations we were given. They were called sea rations, stuff to eat the way we ate, so on. And so that's the way it was until we got to our point there. And this was an underground fort which had been built centuries ago. I don't know which century, by the French. It was in Belgium. It was built at that time. The men were divided up into 4 squads of 11 each, and each one had a sergeant. And then for the platoon, you also had a master sergeant. So each sergeant was in charge of 11. There were 44, actually. Each man had certain kind of guns, either rifle, one would have a semi-automatic, 2 would be in semi-automatic weapon, so on. So they had us also organized. So we could organize what we had to do. So it was set up, organized. The way it came out in actual combat was not always that way. It was the best way to do it. Service was a different thing, because the guys were from all different people who had been tailors. Don't forget, I was 21, and most of them were about my age. They didn't accept anybody who was 28 years old. They weren't eligible. They were non-eligible. I learned how to organize. Taught me about organization. You learn that. That's for sure. But when you finally got into combat, it was very hard to keep up the organization. It was difficult, but you did the best you could. Then after combat when I was in you'd call it military police, but it was sort of guarding supplies that were sent up to the front. I was put on limited duty. It's as I said, it's the first thing you think about. First you're scared, and then you think about staying alive for yourself as fire goes. Then you think about, hey, you're responsible for, you've got to do certain things, and that's what you do. You automatically do what they taught us, even though, and generally in our case, the German troops were generally about 500 yards away. But then, as they were retreating, they would leave behind men. And when we come to a small town or something, you'd have snipers and shooting. We didn't know anything about medicine. There was no such thing as mental illness. There were no psychiatrists. There was no such a thing as a psychiatrist or psychologist. There were no antibiotics. The only thing you had was sulfur for wounds and other things. And you had doctors, what could they do? When you think about it now, going back, they could do cutting, taking out wounds, and using anesthesia. Ether was used a lot. And so if they taught us, if a man refused to go into combat, you were supposed to shoot him. Let's say he was mentally ill-equipped, but we didn't do that. We just sent them back. So there was, things like mental illness only occurred in the United States starting in the very late 50s when you were born. Before then, you ask your parents whether they had psychiatrists. A lot of guys went home and they just lived their lives. It made you, because when you're so young, you think you can do anything. Most kids, when you talk to young kids, today is different. They start in earlier. But when I was 21, physically too, you felt you could do anything. You didn't feel as if anything could kill you. Well, we all wanted to go because of the circumstances. That in the United States, I didn't tell you this, in the United States, they had fifth columnists. They had Germans. Boys my age belonged to the Bund. They were German-American wearing Nazi insignia in Yorkville in New York. They would march in favor of the Germans. Between 1939 and 1941, Germany attacked Poland in September 39. We entered the war in December 41. So for 2.5 years, you had kids for Germany. They belonged to the Bund. And at that time, Germany signed a peace treaty with Russia. they divided up Poland, and they were allies. So Russia was our enemy at the beginning, until Germany invaded Russia in 1941.